Okay, hello. Welcome to another video on behaviorism and meaning. Today I'm talking about my good old friends B.F. Skinner and Charles E. Osgood. Well, I've talked about Skinner before in my Behaviorism and Mind series, but I've never really talked about Charles Osgood, so this will be interesting. This will be a challenge. Osgood is difficult. So yeah, I'm going to try to combine them. Both of their works are very rich, but on the topic of meaning, I'm going to try to be brief. So Skinner, I can be brief. Osgood, it's more just the difficulty of his work makes it hard to talk about. And so I'm just going to try to do it in a brief overview kind of way. Skinner's theory of meaning is pretty simple, so I don't think it'll take too much work. Osgood's theory is super complicated in its details, but I think you can get the basics kind of quickly. And it will also be interesting to compare them in a direct way, to have them side by side like this. They came from competing schools of behaviorism, so you can get maybe a good contrast in that way. Skinner, at least by his critics, perhaps, by people like Osgood, would be called a single-stage behaviorist. Skinner called himself a radical behaviorist, You can tell how radical he looks up there. And Osgood called himself he was a two-stage behaviorist, and then he was a three-stage behaviorist, or also a neo-behaviorist. So he sometimes called his tradition neo-behaviorism. So it has multiple stages built into it. So let me introduce them a little bit. I don't think I have a whole lot of I don't think I have a separate slide for this. No, not really, but you can see our chronology there. B.F. Skinner, 1904-1990. Charles E. Osgood, similar generation, 1916-1991. I like this picture better. So Skinner, one of the most famous American psychologists. I think he's also deeply misunderstood. It's easy. I think I talked about this in my other video on him. There was a kind of turning against him during the 1970s, and his reputation never really recovered. Some cultural stuff at the time. So I'm not going to get into that now. But he did help to sustain popular interest in behaviorism after Watson. After kind of the career and eventually life of Watson ended, Skinner took on the mantle of behaviorism popularizer. His own version of behaviorism, as I mentioned, was called radical behaviorism. He was probably more influenced by books than teachers. He doesn't talk a lot about his teachers so much. His view of behaviorism came more out of reading Bertrand Russell, John Watson, Ivan Pavlov, people like that. He was also influenced somewhat by operationism, which I've talked about from time to time, which is the idea that the meaning of a concept of something is how you measure it. Skinner focuses a lot on the consequences of behavior. This makes his own theories similar to pragmatism, right? Pragmatists always talk about the consequences. What are the consequences of something? And that goes into your concept of its meaning. And if you're interested kind of in the background of Skinner, like the intellectual background and his relation to pragmatism and other ideas, I really like the articles of a guy, Roy A. Moxley, M-O-X-L-E-Y, Roy Moxley. He's done a number of articles on that on Skinner, which I think are really interesting. Yeah, if you don't know Skinner's work, probably the one thing you should know first is that his main goal is the prediction and control of behavior. So he's not seeking truth exactly. He's seeking how can we better control behavior to get better consequences. He thought that behavior can best be predicted and controlled by looking to the environment, right? Because you can't see. We don't have good tools for just conveniently looking inside the organism and understanding the state of the organism, but we can observe its environment and what it does in this or that environment. The environment determines behavior in two ways, he said. It determines behavior through natural selection working on how the species evolves. And it determines, so there's genetics, in other words, or phylogeny, and it determines behavior in the present by reinforcing or punishing the behaviors of individuals. So making certain behaviors more or less likely to reoccur. So development, ontogeny, whatever you want to call it, cultural, socialization, things like that. So knowing more about these environments help us better predict and control behavior. On the control side, however, you want to know more about the relationship between the present environment and individuals' behaviors, because the present environment is what you can control. Obviously, you can't control the ancestral environment that we evolved in. It already happened. And, well, we have some tools now for modifying people's genes, but it's not so convenient, and we're not really sure what's going to happen when we do it. So, even now, so many years later, probably the best we can do is modify someone's environment and thus modify their behavior. So Skinner did not really use meaning as a technical term. He translated it into his own concepts. He did sometimes use the word just because he liked to relate his ideas to the common sense ideas, just so people would understand what he was talking about. And I'll talk about meaning in the context of Skinner's basic framework for understanding behavior, his three-term contingency. Let's see, did I print this wrong or what? I need page 2. But I do not see a page 2. All right. Anyway, for some reason my printer, or me interacting with my printer, got stuff in the wrong order, but I do have page 2, on which I have some information about Charles Osgood, less famous outside psychology than Skinner. Osgood's position is sometimes called neo-behaviorism. This was more concerned about what was happening inside the organism. So more interested about what's going on inside neurologically, physiologically. Was influenced by developments in neuroscience, in cognitive science. So it kind of combines traditional behaviorism with sort of modern non-behavioristic developments like cognitive science. While Skinner was particularly influenced by reading Watson, Osgood was a student of Clark Hall, who I think was the same generation roughly as John B. Watson. And Hall had a much more complicated theory of behavior compared to Watson or Skinner. And Osgood's theory is also quite complicated. This might be fine. Behavior is a complicated topic, so you might need a complicated theory. This is what Osgood thought. He talked about this. And he thought Skinner's theories were too simple. So they were a good start maybe, but he thought they were too simple. It was like the prototype or the the thing he used when he was talking about. So he also reviewed Skinner's book Verbal Behavior. I mentioned that Morris also reviewed. They reviewed it in the same issue of a journal. Osgood reviewed Skinner's version of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, which came out in 1957. And he thought Skinner's theory was kind of like a kiddie car, like kind of a child's car. So you can get where you're going with it, where you want to go with it, but it's not ideal. Osgood was trying to build up to what he thought was the kind of Model T theory of behavior, or Model T theory of verbal behavior, at least. And so he was humble in that regard. He was building on Skinner, getting from the kiddie car to the Model T, but not really at something like a Tesla, as we would say today. Let's see. So his main work on meaning, his main work is on meaning and language behavior, and he's probably best known for his work on the semantic differential, which I'm not going to talk about. I could talk about it in the future if anyone wants, but I'm not planning to talk about it now. But you might, if you hear about him at all, it's often in connection with the semantic differential. This was a way of measuring meaning by plotting where a word falls among contrasting pairs of qualities, such as good, bad, strong, weak, and so on. So you can take any word and see where it falls among all these different criteria, and you have a measurement of the meaning of a word. So it's worth knowing about, but again, I'm not going to get into that today. So he also developed a 2-stage and then a 3-stage theory of behavior. So while Skinner, B.F. Skinner, did not think behavior could be usefully explained, predicted, and controlled by looking inside the organism, he thought it was more useful to look at the environment again. Osgood posited various mediational neuropsychological stages that he thought would better explain behavior. And he doesn't have too much to say about the environment. I'm going to try to summarize Osgood's 3-stage theory mainly today. So, whoops. And I lost this thing, which I need to change the slides. Okay. So what to read? There's a million things you could read by Skinner that are all useful, just to give something if you're interested. His book about behaviorism is just easy to read, accessible, I think. Yeah. So chapters 5 and 6, I would recommend. I think that's on perception and language or something, perception and verbal behavior maybe. So those are connected with what we'll be talking about today, but it's a good introduction to Skinner's style of behaviorism, radical behaviorism. Osgood, the thing to read probably is his lectures on language performance, especially lecture 2, Things and Words. That's where I got most of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. But he has like a lot of different articles and stuff that cover similar territory. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about Skinner, meaning in the context of Skinner's 3-term contingency. The central part of Skinner's theory of behavior is his 3-term contingency. So more threes, you get that a lot. Things coming in threes. This applies to what he called operative behavior. Operative behavior is what we would more like in vernacular language call learned behavior that has some effect on the environment. So it operates on the environment. The 3-term contingency can be confusing because Skinner used several different names for the 3 parts over his career. There's maybe 2 main, how operant behavior is formed. He used, these are mainly the 2 big classes, and within those 2 big classes of terms, there's different variations. But early on in his career, he talked about stimulus, response, and reinforcing stimulus. So the organism discriminated or perceived in vernacular language something. Yes, my pages are out of order. So it discriminates something in the environment, sees, hears, whatever, something in the environment, responds to it. There's a response, and this response, something occurs because of this response that stimulates the organism to do that response again or not in the future. So later on, he recognized that you can't always know what the exact stimulus was. Right? There's multiple variables. You don't know which one was important or which one was mainly controlling, or it might have been like several things controlling the response. So you can't always know the exact stimulus, and sometimes many environmental factors work together to produce a response. So he talks about the setting or the occasion in which or on which a behavior takes place. And he also generalizes the third term, reinforcing stimulus, as consequences. And the consequences might reinforce the behavior, or they might make it less likely to occur. They may punish the behavior. So I'll mainly use setting, response, consequence to talk about Skinner's three-term contingency. So I like his later description a little better. So what about meaning? What about meaning? Well, you can talk about the meaning of the setting or the meaning of the response. So this is kind of where we'd be talking about signs. If we're talking about someone like Peirce or Morris, we'd be talking about signs. Morris, who I talked about, he talks about the context and about signs, but he didn't really talk about the context. But it was kind of there, but didn't say much about it. So Skinner, right, brings those together. A setting might be composed of various signs, but you don't always know what sign is doing what in terms of influencing the response. So you can talk about, so when you respond to some part of the world, it's because that part of the world has meaning to us. And it takes on that meaning because of its consequences for us in the past. We respond to some object or event. This response has good or bad consequences for us, and so we become more or less likely to respond that way in the future. He also calls these consequences contingencies of reinforcement, right? Things that happen that reinforce your response. Reinforce that behavior, that operant behavior. So the meaning of the setting is the behavior it leads to and the consequences of that behavior. This is a bit similar in other people we've talked about, where meaning is like, well, with Morris, it's more fresh in my mind because I just talked about Morris. You have meaning as the signification and the interpretant, right? So it's kind of a combination of those two things. Interpretant here would be response. Consequences maybe could be related to the object. But so the meaning of the setting is both the response and the consequences to that response. That shows what the meaning of the setting was for the organism. Skinner writes, so I'm going to quote Skinner now. He says, to investigate how a situation looks to a person, or how he interprets it, or what meaning it has for him, we must examine his behavior with respect to it, including his descriptions of it. And we can do this only in terms of his genetic and environmental histories. So you're looking at someone's behavior in respect to a setting, a situation, and the genetic and kind of lifetime consequences that have occurred because of that response. So, and he mentions genetic and environmental histories. So these are past contingencies of reinforcement, or the various kinds of consequences that a behavior led to in an individual's or a species past. Okay. So to give a Skinnerian example is taken from About Behaviorism. A rat may be reinforced with food for pressing a lever in the presence of a flashing light. And it may be reinforced with water for pressing a lever in the presence of a steady light. To the rat, the flashing light means food and the steady light means water, right? Because when it has a response, does a certain response to those settings, those objects, it receives certain consequences that it wants. So you can also talk about the meaning of the response. So going down to my second point there, talk about the meaning of the response. So let's say the rat is then put in a box with two levers. One lever is near a flashing light and one lever is near a steady light. Let's say it presses the lever near the flashing light. In this case, we would say that the response means food, right? It knows that the flashing light, if it presses a lever when there's a flashing light, it gets food, so it goes to the flashing light, the lever by the flashing light, which means basically I want food, and presses the lever. If it presses the lever near the steady light, the response means water, right? So that's the meaning, that's because that's the consequences of it. The physical response looks the same, so the pressing might look the same, but you have to look, but it has two different meanings. So pressing the lever, pressing a lever is pressing a lever, but has two different meanings depending on the situation and the consequences that it is, you would say, anticipating, but that's not a very Skinnerian way to talk about it. I have to be careful with my mentalistic language. So to find the meaning of a behavior, in other words, you got to look to its controlling variables, to its setting and the consequences. In this case, to the light and the food or water that the animal may desire. But again, we try not, I guess, not, it's hard to talk about behavior when you're trying not to use, when you are trying not to use ordinary mentalistic language. Anyway, moving on. So for Skinner, yeah, verbal behavior and nonverbal behavior work basically in the same way and are meaningful in basically the same way. The difference is that the history of reinforcement for verbal behavior is necessarily social. So the consequences of verbal behavior are always mediated by other people, either other biological individuals or by yourself at a later time. Find the next page. Many nonverbal behaviors, on the other hand, work directly on the non-human environment and produce consequences that way. So that's the basic difference between verbal behavior and nonverbal behavior is verbal behavior is always working through other people. And nonverbal behavior can work also on other things that are not people. So conclusion, this is just all I want to say about Skinner in the context of meaning. I've talked about him in more detail in my video about mind, and I've written about him in various situations. So his theory is pretty simple and elegant. There are lots of other details we could get into, especially about verbal behavior, and also about how different schedules of reinforcement influence meaning. Talked about some of these before, as I mentioned. Whether Skinner's theory is sufficient for understanding meaning is another matter. The next person I want to talk about, Charles Osgood, thought a theory of meaning also had to look inside the organism, not just to the environmental setting and consequences. So let's take a look at Osgood's three-stage mediation theory of meaning. And if that's sounds like a mouthful, it's also a brainful. So here it comes. Yeah, I've struggled to understand Osgood's theory for a long time. I don't think I can do it justice here, but I'm gonna try to give an impression of it, kind of a thumbnail, nutshell sketch of it to see how many metaphors I can mix together. Yeah, it's tough stuff, but I'm gonna try to simplify it and give my sense of it. Let's dive in. So take a look at this if you want to get some idea of where we're going, what we're talking about. This is going to look confusing at first. Hopefully it will make some bit of sense by the time I'm done. This is what Osgood, this is from his lectures on language performance, the book I mentioned before. And this is what Osgood called the little black egg of behavior. And this is playing on the idea of a black box. Behaviorism has sometimes been criticized for making the organism a black box. There's an input and an output, but you don't know what's going on in between, right? Stimulus and response, but what's happening in the black box of the organism, we don't know. But Osgood's going to try to tell us what's going on. So other older behaviorism, Osgood claims, was focused on the S and the R, the stimulus and the response. And you see that on either side there of the egg. Got the stimulus on the left, the response on the right. What was observed was a relation between an observable stimulus and an observable response. So in my Skinner example, you observe the relation between a flashing light and a response of pressing a lever. So you see those two things. That's what you know. But you have to assume, of course, a relation between sensory and motor neurons, right? So it's not that a flashing light and a press of a lever are directly related. There must be, you're actually assuming that the organism is perceiving there's some sensory apparatus going into operation and some motor apparatus going into operation to press the lever. There's at least those two parts, which is in this outer level, which is labeled with a Roman numeral 1. And it's got this S with a dot above it and R with a dot above it. All right. So even though behaviorisms weren't talking about this level of the organism, they had to assume it, and or the whole thing doesn't work. Yeah, so you have to assume some mechanism actually doing something, perceiving and acting. But this SR model of behavior has some problems. So the basic problem is that we don't just learn to relate stimuli and responses, we also learn to relate stimuli and other stimuli, a stimulus and another stimulus, and we relate responses and other responses. So it's hard to talk about that with just an SR psychology. So two-stage behaviorism tried to solve some of this. So this would be people like Clark Hull, who was it's Hull, was Osgood's teacher, and Edward Tolman, who was also kind of in that generation. So this two-stage behaviorism moves into the area designated as level 2. So this inside, but not totally inside, but kind of the inner oval of the egg is labeled 2, which is going to be a little confusing later. But he's talking about where the theory moved, not in kind of the logical stage of perception and action. So anyway, two-stage behaviorism moved into this level 2, which he calls the representation level. This breaks down into, do I have a slide about that? No, I think I was gonna make a slide and then I forgot. So it moves into the area designated as level 2, this area of representation or meaning, basically. This actually breaks down the basic SR relation into two independent relations. So you've got this S. If you look at the left side, you've got an S. And if you go into the middle, you've got this RM. And then that goes, kind of turns into SM, which ultimately turns into R. So you've got this relation between SRM and SMR, if that makes sense. So the subscript M here stands for mediational. So you've got this overt stimuli, this overt stimulus, which gets represented in the organism as this RM, this mediational response. That's kind of the brain's response to the stimuli. The brain's representation of the external stimuli is this RM. And RM is kind of like meaning. That's going to be the where Osgood sees meaning. So there's the equation RM is meaning, or meaning is RM, which was criticized by people like Jerry Fodor, and there's a whole thing about it. But not getting too much into the complications there. So this representation in the brain is then a stimulus for further action. So it gets converted into this SM, which kind of the flip side of meaning is the intention, right? The significance flips into the intention of what you're going to do. So the RM is a stimuli, turns into a stimuli for action, which ends up as the observable response, the big R at the end there. So yeah. Maybe to summarize that, in between the stimulus and the response comes a mediational response, which functions as a mediational stimulus for the actual response. So let's go through an example. Take the example of a rat in a box, which we've talked about. Every so often, let's say every so often, there's a buzzer, and after 5 seconds, the rat receives a shock through the floor. So you might not like this if you're an animal lover, but this is the kind of experiment people did. I don't know if they still do this kind of thing, but this was big in the 20th century. So the rat gets a shock. It starts moving around somewhat randomly because it's been shocked and it doesn't know what to do. Eventually, it bumps into a lever on the wall that stops the shock, or a button or whatever. Bumps into something on the wall. I'm going to say a lever. And that stops the shock. After some number of trials of this thing, buzzing and getting shocked, the rat learns to press the lever when the shock comes. As soon as it gets the shock, it's like, oh yeah, there's that lever I need to press. Goes, presses the lever. And eventually it learns to press the lever after the buzzer, but before the shock. So it hears the buzzer and it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to get shocked. I better go press that lever. And it does it. And it does not. And then it does not get shocked, right? So here you've got two stimuli, the buzzer and the shock. Find the rest of my notes. The buzzer and the shock. In ordinary language, we would say that the rat forms a memory of what happened before. The buzzer triggers that memory, and the memory triggers the response. This is not how Osgood would describe it, but it's hard to make sense of it unless you use kind of our ordinary mental concepts. So the buzzer triggers a memory of getting shocked in the past. You don't want to be shocked, so this triggers the action to go do the response, the correct response that will prevent you from getting shocked, or at least from getting shocked for very long. So here instead of memory, here we've got RM and SM. So you can think of RM and SM maybe as being memories. It's not quite the correct word here, but these are the two functions maybe of let's say a mental representation, an internal representation. Mental is the wrong word, but say a neurological representation, an engram or something would have these flip functions, these two functions, the flip sides of RM and SM, of significance and intention. So he gives a table of this. So the S with a dot is the buzzer, I believe, or is it the shock? No, the S with the dot is the shock. The S in the square is the buzzer, which is kind of a sign of the shock. RT is the total behavior. Rx is pressing the lever. So you have the shock, which leads to a whole bunch of behaviors the first time, for example. But eventually it forms the part of that forms the mediational response. Part of that gets stored, I guess, or represented as a mediational response. And that's an automatic thing that happens. So something happens to you and it changes your neurons, let's say. And that's automatically connected with SM in this example, which leads eventually to the creation of RX, which is pressing the lever, kind of the response that you're learning, the learned response. So RT is just all the stuff that you might do. RX is the actual learned part of that you want to keep. Yeah, so that's two-stage behaviorism. It's already kind of difficult stuff. But now we're going to go on to three-stage behaviorism. And we'll get to that in a moment. So then we get to three-stage behaviorism. Let me go back to this big egg. So Osgood felt that two-stage behaviorism was insufficient to deal with complex behaviors like language. So he added level 3, which, I mean, if you're thinking logically, it's level 2, but he calls it level 3 because it was added third, which is this integration level. So Roman numeral 3, he adds, which is the integration level. This is where perceptual and behavioral organization takes place. So it's where you're relating various stimuli to create a perception, various kind of sensory stimuli to create a visual perception, or not necessarily visual, but some kind of perception. And on the other hand, it's where various motor behaviors, motor tensions, and so on are put together into a kind of action, a kind of act. So you don't have learning, he says, at level 1. So level 1, where he's got projection level, where he breaks it down into icons and motons, so just the kind of the brute sensory stimuli and the brute physical muscular movements. You don't have learning there, he suggests. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you don't have learning at level 1, the projection level, which is just receptor and effector sensory motor neurons of the peripheral nervous system. Sensory data is organized into perceptions at the integration level. That's why he calls it the integration level. And motor impulses are organized into actions at this level too, on the other side. So learning at this level, the integration level, is based on frequency. At least that's what he proposes. So the more often groups of icons or motons, so icons on this side, motons on the right side, are enacted together, or stimulated together, whatever, during input or output, the more likely you are to get stabilized perceptions or actions. So then you might just see a certain group of icons and it gets turned into a perception of something, right? So you're not seeing, every time you look at an object, you're not seeing every part of it, you're just seeing a certain number of bits of it, and that gets integrated into a perception that you recognize as something, which I guess happens in level 3. Level 2, the inside part. This is why his Roman numerals are confusing there. Okay, so, and this idea of frequency seems to be based on the work of Donald O. Hebb, if you're H-E-B-B, if you're familiar with him. I've used him a lot in my writings, but I'm hoping to maybe I'll do a video on him someday. I would like to but I haven't so far. So Osgood says that these levels here, so the projection level, integration, and representation level, provide the organism with 3 mirrors of reality. So at level 1, the projection level gives us a mirror of what is, right? If you're talking about, so going from the encoding to decoding levels, right? So on the left side, you've got encoding. On the other side, you've got decoding. So that's the encoding of sensory information into the nervous system. Decoding is taking that information and putting it into action. That's what he's talking about with encoding and decoding. So on the encoding side, you've got these 3 levels of reality. Level 1, projection level, you've got a mirror of what is. Level 3, or logically level 2. At the integration level, you've got the mirror of what ought to be. So you might not. So at level 1, you get energy from the environment hitting your receptors. But at the integration level, you actually put that into a perception. That gets formed into a perception, right? Which is kind of combining what is actually there with what has been there in the past. Because you never see all of an object all the time, but you experience it from different angles and so on. And so I've talked about that before. And if you think about perception, that's how it has to work, because you're not capable of seeing everything all the time. But you get impressions, and that gets integrated into, like, oh, I know that's my clock, that's my water bottle, whatever. So it's what ought to be. That's what it should be based on the currently available sensory data. And then level 2, or logically level 3, at the representation level, is the mirror of what is signified. So what does that mean? Right? What is the meaning of that perception based on past relation to behavior? My clock, the meaning of it is I can know what time it is. The meaning of my water bottle is that if I'm thirsty, I can use that to be less thirsty. And this is related to conditioning or reinforcement. Okay, and then on the decoding side, the action side of things, the level 1, so now we're talking about the motons or motor system, kind of the brute motor system of what is actually done when you do an action, what muscle fibers are actually activated. So that's the mirror of what is actually done. Working back more further into the organism, so to speak, you've got that integration level, which is the mirror of what is programmed. So what kind of various actions are put together to form a whole act. What sequence of muscle movements are being put together to form an act. It's kind of like a program for your for an action. And it's kind of like what your brain is telling your muscles to do. And then working back into level 2, which is the middle of the egg, the representational level, you have the mirror of what is intended. So you have an idea of what you plan to do, what you want to do. That gets translated into a sequence of muscle acts, and then you actually do it. And it may not be exactly what you intended, maybe close enough, or maybe it's not, but whatever it there is some intention there of what you plan to do. Okay, and then looking back, just say a couple of words about the very inside of the black egg there. You've got a level 4, which he also then put in. So maybe this is 4-stage behaviorism, but he doesn't call it that. But there is a level 4. But this really is just adding details to level 2. Again, his numbers are confusing, but you've got a level 4 inside of level 2, and that's just adding details. It's showing you more about what's going on in level 2. It's showing you the componential nature of meaning. So it's not a unitary thing, but it's put together from smaller components. So meaning, per se, is more like a summary that includes bits of smaller things. So it's formed out of parts of Where's my last page? Yeah. It seems I'm missing, ended up missing page 6. Um, let me grab that because it's important for what I want to say. But anyway, level 4, you've got these, see if I can get my mouse in the right place. So you've got this M1, M2, M3. There's just these parts of meaning that can be recombined to form meanings, representations, or intentions on the motor side of it. Okay. Yeah, so just to finish up here, there's a lot of complexity here, obviously, that you can go into on your own if you're interested. I can't say I fully understand Osgood's theory. There's something there that I think is valuable. Maybe quite a lot there that's valuable, but it needs to be maybe I would want to kind of reconceive it in some way, in a more flexible or streamlined way or something. It's difficult to use. And it seems like he makes too much of a break between perception and action, or the encoding and decoding phase of things. This tendency to kind of break up perception and action was criticized by pragmatists like Dewey, John Dewey, and also by physiologists like Edmund Jacobson. Right? You don't go through life waiting for perceptions, then acting, then waiting for another perception, then acting again, and so on. You're always doing both, and it's not clear if it's not quite clear how you get to this the more kind of tangled up relation between or intimate relation between perception and action that we find in reality. But this might be a good starting place. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. A lot of interesting distinctions he makes that might be worth exploring. Yeah, but I would want to make things a little more fluid somehow. So it may be a good thing to combine with Skinner, perhaps. Skinner kept things a bit more fluid, I think, in my view. And in that way, a bit more realistic, although, yeah. So Skinner emphasizes the environment quite a lot, as I mentioned, and he only has a little bit to say about the experiences of the organism, at least in any really systematic way. He does talk about thoughts and feelings and stuff, but his kind of his main emphasis is on the environment. Osgood goes maybe to the other extreme, emphasizing the organism's experience, or not really experience, but internal processing, and largely ignores the environment, as far as I can tell. So it may be good to try to balance these things, to balance Skinner's radical behaviorism with Osgood's neo-behaviorism. So anyway, that's the end of what I have to say for today. Just remember Skinner's three-term contingency of setting response consequences, where the meaning of the setting is the response, which is controlled by the consequences, and the meaning of the response is the setting and the consequences which control it. And remember Osgood's black egg of behavior, where RM, or mediational representation, is the meaning. This is the way a stimulus is represented or encoded in the brain, where it becomes a mediational stimulus, SM, which is decoded by the body into action. So can put all of that into your pipe and smoke it. In the next video, I'm going to talk about something a little easier for me, at least. Not quite so, well, it has its own complexities, but it's not quite as baroque as something like Osgood's black egg. Going to talk about Morse Peckham and his meaning of behavior. So I hope you'll check it out. And thanks for listening. Have a good day. Bye.